Hello, fellow druids. Welcome to another full circle. And, well, pardon me. In this episode, what I'm going to discuss is I asked my Facebook group for some ideas for topics. I have a few things, but I figured I would see what the people, the druids, what they were interested in. And one of the topics, and the first one that actually got suggested, was actually talking about how Bradigus pairs with Kreuger 2. And I actually responded that I'm still actually, for the most part, if I were going to a tournament, like right after I was done recording this, I would still be playing my Una 2 Kreuger 2 pairing, which is, I responded in the thread about that. But I've actually considered also pairing Bradigus with Una 2. So where that leads us is into what I want to talk about, which is where does Bradigus fit? So I think I've actually done a recent, I thought about doing just a full-on like re-review of Bradigus, but I'm pretty sure I've actually done that since his changes back in December. So I don't really want to necessarily delve very deeply into like every stat and whatnot that Bradigus has. What I want to do is talk about where I think he fits and how I think he can play, because I think it's going to be a bit misleading. I actually there's a lot of trepidation in the Circle community right now, at least what I see on Facebook, mind you, and on a few other forums. But it seems to me that there's just a ton of concern about shooting in the game, and that's what's brought Kreuger. That's what's always kept Kreuger 2 on top of the game, right? Because especially now, where the longer range shooting that we saw at the beginning of R3 has, for the most part, declined, and a lot of the but a lot of lists still have quite a few guns usually in them. But we're not really seeing anything greater than range 14. We do see a lot of things range 14 and shorter, right? Like we see trenchers, we see lightning stuff too, which he's great into, of course, and so forth. So there's a lot of that type of stuff going on. But anyways, there's a lot of trepidation about shooting, and I think Kreuger fits in that nicely. Wormwood obviously is very strong into things like that. Baldur 2 has the armor for it. There's others. Kreuger 1, Baldur 1 have some play there. Morvana 1. And then certain lists can adjust it accordingly too. But when you look at Bradigus, he does not immediately have a lot of range protection. And so you really have to look at where does he fit in your list. Bradigus does not natively have that. However, depending on how you approach playing Bradigus, and part of this is I have actually only played him a little bit. I've actually been meaning to get some games in with him, so I'm going to kind of talk about some thoughts I have about him with this, and then I'm hopefully going to play him this week on Thursday at my normal game night, and then next week, or if I'm really, probably next week, probably early next week, I hope to have a video about if I like how my findings on the table paired up with my theory that I'm talking about right now. So, but I just want to look at Bradigus separately for a second. So he does a lot of there's a lot of things that he actually does bring to the table. He brings a threat range increase. He brings wolds, and the thing where I go back to talking about the ranged attacks is wolds are sort of naturally resilient to ranged attacks. So you're like, but Chad, what about Bradigus? Won't he just get shot? Sort of, right? So Wold Guardians are shield guards. Wold Whites are shield guards. The list, I'm just going to run through it. This is, I butcher his name every time, but Polish Thomas, we call him Tomasz, I don't know how to say it. I like his list that he's played recently. He's got a few variations, but the one I like is one that includes 2 Wold Guardians, 3 Wold Whites, 4 Wold Watchers, 2 Shifting Stones, 2 Sentry Stones, and the 5 Black Cloud Solos, with 3 of them being free. I like that list because it's actually on its own very resilient to shooting, right? So I go back to talking about that, and the thing is, like I said, it can do a lot of different things, right? It reminds me a bit of my Una 2 list, wherein it's not, that list is not necessarily super strong into shooting, right? Like mass shooting. The Wolf Riders don't terribly like pretty like potent guns generally, especially long range ones. They don't like anything like things that remove stealth. They don't really like, or things like that, because the Griffins have stealth. But against most things, stealth is going to be enough. The Wolf Riders outrange most guns, especially with Mirage. If you really think about it, they have a 16-inch threat natively, like walk and throw, where most guns are in that 16 to 20 range. The 20 is kind of problematic for them, but they can assault to 19 if they need to. Even they can hide behind terrain and reposition behind it. Like, there's a lot of things they can do. Wolds are naturally pretty high armor, right? You're not just trivially shooting a Wold Guardian off the table. That's just not going to happen. It's armor 20. It's got 35 boxes. And you have the ability to spread some damage around. Wold Watchers are going, or sorry, yeah, I said that right. Wold Watchers go up to armor 21 on their own, and they only cost 8 points. So congratulations if you shoot one 8-point light off the table. Same thing with Wold Whites, right? 5 points. Their stats are certainly nothing to write home about, but if you don't deal with them, they're going to deal with you. Bradigus has ranged attack to help. The Sentry Stone by itself is pretty resilient to shooting. The Shifting Stones are pretty resilient to shooting. The Wayfarers have prowls, so you can hide them, or you can hide them behind other things. The Stone Shapers have the Stone Sentinel rule, which makes them 15-15 generally, as long as you position well. Bradigus is only a 14-16, but he can have transfers, and he can have shield guards. So then, on top of it, he brings synergy. So on any given turn, you can get +5, and this is true for Kai 3 as well. You can get +5 out of any model in his battle group other than himself, and he can get +3 actually. That means you can send in, if you need to, a P+S 23 Wold Guardian. In theory, he might be able to kill 2 heavies. I'd have to do the math on it. But even if we just go in with the, like with +2, a Wold Guardian, I think, trades with a Khador heavy just fine. Let's see, so you get 5 attacks, 7 damage on average, 35. Yeah, so just the simple +2 means he's doing 35 damage to a Khador Jack. If we start talking dice +3, he does about 10 damage a hit at that point, meaning he should drop a Khador Jack in 3 hits, and he's going to put 20 damage on another Khador Jack, which is going to put you in the range where if you were able to scratch the paint at all on that Jack, otherwise, you'd probably kill it. Wold Watchers can get up to power and strength 17. Again, with the +5, you can only get 3 at most at +5 because you only have 3 of the guys. But just bear with me, you can get them up to power and strength 17. Again, they're going to get at most 4 attacks. Generally, you're going to be looking more like at 3. You may get a free charge. That's going to put is going to be pretty painful for a lot of things. Realistically, you probably want to more often be using them to get 3 attacks, and then and then use their stone form because you want them to be a big pain in the ass to deal with. Because therein lies the other situation, right? So I don't have the math in front of me, but at armor 21 with 24 boxes, even though they're auto hitting a Khador heavy, let's assume it's a Juggernaut, which is not always the case. But if we assume it's a Juggernaut, they are dice -2 on their axe, and dice minus, I think that's a 16, or no, it's 15. So they're dice -6 on that attack. So they're gonna do about let's see. So they get 2 axe swings at dice -2, so 5, 10, maybe 12 damage for a Juggernaut, unless he starts allocating focus. That's to kill one single Wold Watcher. So in a lot of these lists, the reason I've been considering pairing Bradigus with Una is I look at it as, even though I have the Griffins and I have the Wolf Riders, and I think I can play, if I had more practice with that list, I possibly could play it into Khador more. But I think Bradigus might actually give me a better approach to playing that game. It also, just by the virtue of the way the lists differ, mannequins are free bodies that can be put in the way. You actually have quite a bit of infantry clearing in this list that you would be sort of surprised. Mannequins each have a spray. Your Blackclouds each have a spray. You have 4 guns, and you have the fire from the little Wold White. Plus Bradigus has a gun. So like, you actually have a surprising amount of infantry clearing, as long as you don't need, depending on how like accurate and stuff. But theoretically in a given turn you have access to like 11 sprays. It's a lot. And again, you have a pretty resilient upfront battle group that you have the ability to use your sprays to deal with. So that's kind of where I see Bradigus at right now. So how does he pair up with Kreuger? Well, I think if you paired him with Kreuger too, you're looking for Bradigus to play the role that, in my opinion, right now is played by Una 2, Kaya 3, Chromac 2. Theoretically, you could throw Balder 1 into that mix. Theoretically, I'm trying to think who else would fit in there. Those are the ones that immediately come to mind. Theoretically, you could add Wormwood to that list, depending on your build variety there. So I'm mentally going through all the casters, but mostly those. And again, I think you're mostly talking about those who occupy that armor cracking role, and I think Bradigus can be that, be in that position. Also, that's just one build for him that I discussed, right? There are other ways you could build him. Frankly, you could just build him. So that list that I just said had 4 Wold Watchers and 2 Guardians. The way the math works, Guardians are 16 points, Watchers are 8. You could literally replace, you could, if you wanted to, and I have not played this list at all, so, you know, bear with me. You could easily replace the 4 Watchers with 2 more Guardians, so that you had 4 Guardians. You also, if you needed more bodies then to generate synergy, you could replace the 2 Sentry Stones with 2 more Wold Whites. So you could go 4 Guardians and 5 Whites, still have all of your support solos and your shifting stones. And that becomes a very interesting list indeed. I think obviously you're going to lose some clearing, you're going to lose some ability to stay in zones, and in return you're going to gain a whole lot of punch. You could also go with like Wold Wardens in that mix-up. You could try to get Megalith into that mix. He's another 4 points, so you probably have to start playing with the math on your list a little bit there. But you might be able to do something like 3 Guardians and Megalith actually. And at that point, now when you go into if set up properly, when you go into something like Khador spam, if that's a problem for you, and that's why I've started addressing it. I've still been having a little bit of trouble when I've actually played into those lists. I think, like I said, that's a problem I have, where I just have not practiced enough with lists I have, plus having some unfortunate dice. But I think into things like Karchev and Harkovich, you could although I think Kruger's fine into Harkovich for a different reason. But I think into those you could play Bradigus, and if you really like, I want to make sure that I'm able to deal with heavies, you can do that. Looking out there at what's being played, I think Bradigus actually can play into a lot of it, in the same way that I feel like Una plays into a lot of it. He has long threat range because of his feet. Theoretically, a Wold Guardian in Shifting Stones is placed 8, pushed 5, and has a 1-inch melee, so 8 and 5 is 13, 1 inch is 14. If you can nail the Hunter's Mark, you're, let's see, it would be normally 7, 9, 5, so I think you go up to 15 at that point. Even just a regular charge, if you need it, is going to be what is it's 7 normal, 7, 8 normally, so 13. Those are some pretty long threats, and considering the tankiness of the models we're talking about, that feat is quite good. Also, it allows you to back up, and something to consider is don't always necessarily assume that every model in your battle group should back up. You usually want to selectively back up. Like, I would leave a couple Wold Watchers forward to be in the way while you're backing up the heavies that you want to send in again next turn. Which is, again, another strength of this list, right? Like I said, dealing with those high armor lights that are not very many points while keeping the things like your Wold Guardians back a little bit but safe. And, of course, the entire time making sure that you're not getting Bradigus killed. You can do that one of two ways. If you have the Guardians, like I said, and the Whites, use your Shield Guards very carefully. If you have Wold Wardens, depending on how many Shield Guards you also brought, consider using their 4-inch forests to block line of sight to him, and then using your Shield Guards to keep those safe. You can do the same thing with your Sentry Stones potentially, if you're really concerned about the range threat. That's something we were doing very early into Mark III. So that's where I see Bradigus fitting, right? He can crack that armor, but he also is pretty resilient into most shooting, which is good, right? He's not... you're going to have to make sure that you play carefully and build carefully for a high volume of ranged attacks, but if you're in that range of medium sort of ranged attacks, I think he's going to be able to do just fine. He plays into cricks surprisingly well because of the long threat ranges, as well as the high number of sprays, as well as right now, actually, cricks is one of the preeminent jack spam lists, and he's going to play into something like an Asphyxious 3 Slayer spam actually pretty well, because you're going to be able to be... One of the things there is that the defense starts mattering, and as soon as you start getting your stuff up to mat 7, 8, and 9, you should be able to overcome that quite a bit. They don't like being knocked down. Really, just like crippling a system against them is going to be enough. They don't want to deal with the wolves in the way either, etc. And you just need to really keep Bradigus safe from the magic attacks that might come in, and he has a spell that helps you deal with that too. So there's a lot of things that I think that Bradigus really helps shore up in the current meta. Again, I think some of those things are playable by other casters. Specifically on the Kreuger 2 Bradigus pairing, in theory, what I'm concerned with is that Kreuger playing in Bones and Bradigus playing in Bones means that if anybody does have a decent solution to Wolds, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble. Just because it's one of the reasons I typically don't like doubling down on the same theme. There is going to be something of an upper limit for Bradigus into certain things. Like I said, there might be a certain threshold of guns that you're going to need to play very carefully with him into. There's probably going to be a certain threshold of certain types of infantry that he's going to struggle into. You're going to need to play him very carefully into things like a lot of Iron Fang pikemen with like an Erusk, or I think, again, because of the threat ranges, you can play him into things like Banes, but you're going to have to be very careful. I'm trying to think of what exactly... there's a lot of lists out there, so forgive me if I'm not remembering all of them. I think he can play into Grimkin, but again, you're going to need to play very carefully. Be very careful with when you're casting spells. They're going to pretty much be able to trigger Ruin whenever they want, so you could lose synergy if you're not careful there. Yeah. So anyways, I'm not going to belabor the point of Bradigus. I actually think he's very good. I think he can play into a lot of things because he kind of brings all of the elements you want. He can hit hard. He can hit accurately. He has a way to extend threat. He has a way to bring a decent number of ranged type attacks, ranged and magic. He has ways of, his list produces ways to be resilient against shooting. And I didn't mention it, but the Wold Whites are kind of important because I think they actually, putting the fire out there is important, but I also think that they have an easy way to start getting your synergy chain going, and they also have the longest natural threat in the list at speed 6 and 1-inch melee. So I do think, I know a lot of people sort of dismiss those early, and I think it depends how you're playing, but I think with Bradigus they have a place. I don't know that you necessarily need like a whole list full of them, but I think that 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 is sort of the right number. 5's sort of pushing the upper limit maybe. If anybody does play with like however many you can fit in the list, I would be very interested to know what your findings are on that, and I'd just like to hear about that. So as far as pairing with Kreuger 2, that's what I see. Pairing with Una, I would be looking to see how cracking armor works. I'm particularly interested in the Kador matchup, possibly into the Krix matchup, depending on a few different things. But I do think it might overlap too much, which is why I've not pulled the trigger on that. I think pairing with Bradigus, if Bradigus is the main list you're going to go with, I think you're going to want to identify the things that it's particularly weak to, and I suspect that is things that crack armor reliably without, but are survivable enough to get there and get the alpha. You may have trouble with things like Abby 2, actually, who I'd have to sit down and do the math, but she may out-threat you in melee, and she will scrap the pretty much any of the wolves in the list she can scrap. She also has just ways around a lot of different things, and everything, and much like his list, everything in her list is very resilient, and your threat range isn't really outdoing it. So in like against an Abby, I actually do like Una 2 better, for example. Against and against some other things, right? The list usually isn't going to be too susceptible to jamming. You do bring RFP, another great feature of Bradigus. If you bring the amount of RFP you need is going to be correlated to the number of Wold Watchers, and you're going to definitely not be lacking for magic weapons. Everything in the list but the Wold Whites, I think, have magic weapons. Including Bradigus, I think is rocks and magic now. I didn't end up actually. I think I did pull them up. We can do that live. Anyways, I'm gonna wind down this. So that's kind of where I see Bradigus sitting in theory. As I said, the list. I'll go through it one more time real quick. Yeah, he's got magic rocks. It's Bradigus. It's 2 Guardians. It's 3 Whites, 4 Watchers, both Shifting Stones, both Sentry Stones, and all 5 solos. If I was going to adjust the list, I would test. I would recommend testing Wold Wardens. You get more use of a spell list that way. You're going to have more infantry clearing potentially, and things of that nature. And then you could also toggle around the lights. Megalith is never a bad add, obviously. He does actually hit harder because of the number of attacks, and a little bit because the accuracy as a Guardian. So if he can fit into the list, certainly consider him. But again, he's 20 points as opposed to 16, so it's not always going to be that easy. So that'll be all. We'll report back. Hopefully next week I'm able to get in a game with the list, possibly 2. I want to report back, and then we'll see how things are going. So as always, thanks for watching.